Hello and welcome to the ninth Symposium on Environmental Justice and Health Disparities at the University of Maryland, SEAGE, Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health. My name is Pamela Bingham. I'm the Operations Manager here at SEAGE, and we're very pleased to have an extremely distinguished panel and a very diverse panel to talk about the issues around environmental justice and the built environment. I'm going to allow each speaker to introduce themselves, name, title, and a background statement. We have, first of all, I'm just looking at my my screen. Dr. Tony Graham. Tony, if you would, Dr. Graham, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Pam. And I'm Tony Graham. I'm a retired professor, social professor from North Carolina A&T State University. And I taught for over 18 years in the Department of Built Environment. And within there, I taught a lot of courses in terms of real estate, land development, structures, project management, sustainable design. And I also taught, because I have a master's in architecture and I have my doctorate in engineering and civil, both from Morgan State, and have a bachelor's in architecture and engineering from A&T. I've also been able to transverse both of those areas in architecture and engineering and civil and infrastructure. And so I do a lot, or have done a lot of research in that area, and also in geosciences and GIS. Most of the time, my research was in areas of sustainable design, construction, neighborhood revitalization and transformation, BIM and GIS, as I mentioned, and environmental justice, modeling of the built environment. And so over the years, I've done a lot of that. And currently, I'm a consultant with the HBCU Environmental Justice Technical Team, which is comprised of geoscientists and engineers. And we do a lot of research in the area of environmental justice throughout the Southeast. I also have done a lot of case studies and worked with communities, most recently in North Carolina and Winston-Salem, in revitalization and transforming of African-American communities, and looked at environmental justice issues that affected those communities as well. I've also worked in private industry, Army Corps of Engineers, both in the United States and in Europe, and in private industry as far as architecture firms and in planning firms, most notably in Devereux and Purnell, Washington, D.C., and Greenhorn and Amera out of Lower Maryland before I started practicing. So, teaching, actually. So that's me in a rough background in areas and how I kind of transverse the environmental justice environment. So thank you very much.
And thank you. We appreciate this panel because of the diversity. Professor Dotson, will you talk to us a little bit about who you are in your background and where you are in the country? You're on mute, Professor Dotson.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was like, I hope no one leaves themselves on mute, and then I did it. Yes, I am a professor of architecture and chair of the Department of Architecture at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, which is about 60 miles northeast of Indianapolis. I've been teaching here for about 23 years. Prior to that, I had a firm. Well, prior to that and during that, I also had a firm, Harmonics, and we specialized in inner city revitalization initiatives in Indiana and around the country. And with my partner, Russell Lewis, an architect practicing in Indianapolis. I currently also work with Dorsey Architects out of Birmingham, Alabama. And we do a lot of work with Equal Justice Initiative, Southern Poverty Law Center, and other institutions, mostly in Alabama, but also here in Indiana. I started I got my undergraduate at Tuskegee down in Alabama. And then I did some postgraduate work here at Ball State for a year, and went to Columbia in the real estate development program back in the late 80s, and worked out in Phoenix, came back to Central Indiana and was practicing and teaching. And I started asking more questions about what the real impact of the type of inner city revitalization work we were doing and what our real impact has been as design professionals. And that's what kind of led me down the path of the pursuit of social environmental justice issues, and started a minor and a graduate certificate in social environmental justice here at Ball State. And to my knowledge, it's the first such program in the country and perhaps the world. And so we've had this program present for about 7 or 8 years. And it's been a real challenge. Thank you.
Yeah, I wasn't talking. I just couldn't find the button. Our next speaker is Stephanie Roberts Bowman. Please introduce yourself, your allegiance or your role in the environmental justice space, and your role as a professional engineer.
Sure. Thanks, Pam. So my name is Stephanie Roberts Bowman. I'm a professional engineer. I went to Howard University and I have an undergrad in civil engineering, and I have a master's degree in environmental engineering. Currently, I'm a project manager at Mecklenburg County Stormwater Services in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I manage several capital improvement programs and projects, including stream restoration projects, and also some other kind of floodplain projects that we do in the county. I have previously worked for the city of Los Angeles, where I was kind of a jack of all trades, and I did a lot of environmental remediation work for the city, not design. I worked for the Bureau of Sanitation, but I did more kind of their environmental work. And I also am president of Sunrise Environmental, Inc., and we are trying to pivot now to provide the government with some environmental engineering services. And I've been doing all of these things for approximately 25 years. And so I am very, currently at my position, I am working with our county manager to implement an environmental justice program where we're assessing our capital improvement projects. And that is in the works currently. So I'm really excited that Pam invited me, and I am really looking forward to this panel. Thank you all.
And what county are you in?
Mecklenburg.
In North Carolina.
In Charlotte, North Carolina.
Excellent. We have some diverse geography here, so that's good as well. That's a different kind of diversity, and it totally relates to the discussion. Our next speaker is Mr. Carlton Ely. And would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Pam. And thanks for the invitation to participate in today's conversation. My name is Carlton Ely. I'm the Senior Director for Federal Strategies at Race Forward. For those who are curious, Race Forward is not an environmental justice organization, but we focus on ways in order to catalyze movement building for racial justice. And we work in partnership with communities, organizations, and sectors, and we build strategies to advance racial justice within policies, institutions, and culture. I am a graduate of a historically Black college and university. I attended Elizabeth City State University in North Carolina. My undergraduate degree was in sociology. Actually, my first experience working on the topic of environmental justice was my junior year while attending Elizabeth City State University. I have a master's degree in urban planning. I studied at the University of Iowa, and I've been an urban planner over the span of roughly about 23 years. While working for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, I actually created a portfolio that focused on the topic of equitable development. As an urban planner, I had some particular concerns in terms of how our place-based programs could actually amplify vulnerability of populations that are underserved and vulnerable, especially people of color. And so I used my role, my discretionary power as a civil servant in order to direct attention to ways in order to advance racial equity or to center racial equity as a civil servant and within the role of environmental protection at EPA. I left EPA in 1998 and I joined Race Forward in September of 2021, again, as their Senior Director of Federal Strategies, where we're responsible for implementing a federal initiative to govern for racial equity. And so I will stop there.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Ely. And last but certainly not least is Kofi Boone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your background and where you are geographically and what you do.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to join the panel. My name is Kofi Boone. I teach landscape architecture and environmental planning at NC State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. So Carolina is very well represented on this panel, which is great. I am a Detroit native. I went to the University of Michigan, which is where I learned about environmental justice for the first time, taking many classes from people like Bunyan Bryant and Dorceta Taylor and a lot of luminaries in the at least academic wing of the movement, and ended up relocating a mile away from where the modern environmental justice movement started in Warren County, the PCB landfill protest there. I teach studios and seminars that align with environmental justice in several different ways. One is to help work with communities to increase their access to environmental benefits, so healthy food, walkable and safe communities, increased urban shading, better access to public spaces, but also environmental harms. So currently we're working with the NC Department of Transportation on guidelines to help them recognize the damage that's been done by highway planning across the state to Black and Brown communities and strategies to remediate and repair that harm that was done, and several other studies dealing with air quality and other things. As a landscape architect, probably the least known profession on the panel, the American Society of Landscape Architects is our national organization, and we were all a part of the group that established the Environmental Justice Professional Practice Network. So we now have within that profession a group of like-minded professionals that are trying to pursue these challenges through our profession. So happy to be here with you.
Outstanding. So in terms of format, I'm going to start off asking some targeted questions. I'm going to give Dr. Graham about 15 to 20 minutes, so you wouldn't be able to show your entire presentation, but we will post your presentation on the website. And then I will go back to questions and everyone will have at least one question. So, you know, we're in this field. I'm an industrial engineer who became an environmental engineer. My first question is really for novices out there. What is the built environment? And I'll start out asking that question of Olin Dotson. What is the built environment? You're muted. You're still muted.
What is the built environment?
And what is the relationship between the built environment and environmental justice?
The relationship between the built environment and environmental justice. Well, I guess part of the motivation that we have is around environmental injustice, and the fact that the built environment has been used as a tool to impede the progress of certain populations all over the world. And so, I mean, I think we all live and reside in space and place that has cultural and social roots, and architecture is certainly, and landscape architecture, urban design is all a product of that and a tool used to facilitate that. but because we also live in an unjust world, there are there's polarization and stratification and limitation that's always been placed on it and it's often very deliberate, like interstate design and redlining and other factors, but also more nuanced because of the fact that privilege drives a lot of decision making, and it doesn't take into consideration everyone in a holistic way. So we oftentimes are the recipients of residing in unjust space. And so I think that environmental justice is really bringing attention to environmental injustice, and that's kind of at the foundation of it.
Thank you very much. So Carlton, what is the definition? Olin, could you mute your mic, please? Thank you. So Carlton Ely, Mr. Carlton Ely, what is the definition of environmental justice, and what then is the definition of gentrification? We hear so much about both topics.
No, thanks for raising that question, Pam. I mean, obviously there's the federal definition. I mean, and by that, I mean, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. But what that definition really means is when we marry environmental protection with a genuine commitment to being socially responsible to communities of color and to low-income communities, we basically realize the outcome of communities that are more healthy, communities that are more sustainable, communities where the outcomes of justice are actually realized. And so that's really where we're trying to focus on it, especially in the context of the built environment. We know that all people are part of an ecosystem, and ecosystems are very delicate. So every human has the right to live in a healthy ecosystem, and the health of that particular system is dependent on making sure that we're proper stewards of it. And so the health of one ecosystem shouldn't come at the expense of another. So the idea of one community being privileged and their privilege overriding or usurping the ability of another community to be thriving and sustaining, that's inconsistent with the goals of encouraging and advancing environmental justice. And I think, as Olin had indicated, that there have been times and instances where there have been certain transactions that have occurred or inconsistencies in terms of how policy has been implemented, where we have valued some communities above others. And that has created basically a landscape of inequity. And that's the reason why we have these conditions of environmental injustice, which we're trying to intentionally correct by thinking more critically about our policies, our practices, our protocols, especially as it relates to environmental protection. Your second question was about the issue of gentrification. And it's interesting you should mention that. The first point I want to acknowledge is when we talk about issues of environmental justice, it's important to reflect on the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And while a lot of people often focus on the fact that 1,100 people gathered in Washington, D.C. in 1991 to focus on the conditions associated with their ecosystems or their built environment, it's also important to note that many people were equally concerned about untenable conditions in housing and land use, infrastructure, and sanitation. All of those issues are relevant to urban planning. In fact, out of the 17 principles of environmental justice, 5 of them are relevant specifically to the built environment. So this is important as it relates to the issue of gentrification, is because when you define gentrification, what it really is a process of neighborhood change that occurs as places of lower economic value are transformed into places of higher economic value while failing, and this is an important note, while failing to mitigate impacts that burden populations that are less economically resilient. That has direct overlap with issues of environmental injustice because populations that are underserved and vulnerable, populations that bore the burden of disinvestment, people who lived in communities before they became fashionable and trendy should actually have the ability to experience the material benefit when redevelopment actually occurs. So the basic way in which I define gentrification is it's a process of neighborhood change that occurs as places of lower real estate value are transformed into higher real estate value, while failing to mitigate impacts that burden populations that are economically resilient, that are not economically resilient. And it's important to note that gentrification is a form of market failure. And the only way to correct market failure is actually to intervene in order to correct the externalities or the unintended impacts from the activity. Just as how we intervene to correct climate change, or just as how we intervene to correct pollution, we also have to be sensitive to intervening to correct market failures as well, like gentrification.
I appreciate that context and that explanation. You know, people throw around a lot of the terminology, and I'm not always sure if they really understand what they're saying. I just got off a panel which was about women in environmental justice, and it kind of, one of the participants was talking about all the flooding in her community. So I'll ask this question of Stephanie Roberts Bowman. How does floodplain displacement, flooding, stream restoration, these are not concepts that people always connect to environmental justice. So how does your work, how does it all come into play in your work in environmental justice?
So I mentioned earlier what I'm trying to work on now. The Stormwater Services Division of Mecklenburg County is working on now with the county manager as part of the county's larger environmental justice program. And part of that is two of our major capital improvement projects that we do, or programs that we have. And they are our floodplain buyout program and our stream restoration program. And Charlotte is very unique in that we have 3,000 miles of stream, which is insane. Every time I think about that, you literally can, if you lay them end to end, you can go from Charlotte to LA. So we have an inordinate amount of streams. And of course, due to, as Carlton said in an earlier conversation, due to root causes that caused Black Americans who descend from slaves in this country to be located in these areas on these FEMA regulated floodways, they're being flooded out. And at the same time that they're being flooded out, just to kind of ties into gentrification that you all were just discussing, they're being pushed out. So we have a floodplain buyout program, not just our county, but around the country. There are different municipalities and cities and counties that are also implementing this program because we want people and property not to be damaged by floodwaters. And so we're offering to purchase property owners' homes, and then they can move somewhere else. But as Carlton just stated, where are they going to move? If the market has dictated that they can't relocate within the area where they've always lived and where their families have generationally lived, not just them. And so what we're trying to look at is the method in which we are appraising homes. Because, for example, if someone lives here and the floodway it can be large, it can be small, it can be 100 feet across. You just don't know. It depends. It's very stream dependent. But it can, one house on this side of the street, for example, can be in the floodway, and then directly across the street, they're out of the floodway. And that can be as much as of a difference of $100,000 in property value. And so you have someone on this street who has generationally been displaced, disenfranchised, suffered from these harms, but because they live on this side of the street and most likely they were redlined into that area, their home is then worth $100,000 less than the home across the street. And when we go in and offer them to purchase the property, and we're offering it at a price lower than the house across the street, because then we are saying that, well, you're in the floodplain. It's kind of this circular logic, right? So, however many years ago we redlined you here, but now because you're here, your house is worth less and we can't offer you as much. So we are trying to work through that because that is an absolute EJ issue. And when you're talking about with the built environment, of course, that is where the homes were built, right? And that is where they were placed. With stream restoration, it's a little bit more nuanced because stream restoration is a very niche part of environmental engineering. First of all, it's not practiced in a lot of places in the nation. And essentially, it is trying to restore the streams that were historically straightened by the Army Corps of Engineers or other normally federal entities long ago at the turn of the century, trying to return them to their natural state to basically connect them back to their floodplain. Because when we don't, what ends up happening is you have a lot of energy. Water, clearly, I'm not going to go through, I'm sure everybody kind of knows, but water carries a lot of energy. And so what ends up happening is that the streams just get straighter and straighter and deeper and deeper. And you have a lot of infrastructure in stream banks, such as water and sewer lines. They fail. So there's this kind of snowball effect is what happens if you don't take care of the streams. But oftentimes what happens is as we are determining which streams we're going to restore, we connect that. We do joint projects with our Parks Department. And along with the Parks Department, they build greenways. And so again, it kind of loops back into the gentrification that, all right, so we're restoring the stream, but we're also now building a greenway. And maybe we're not causing gentrification, but in the way that we're implementing these projects, are we stopping? Are we halting it? We're building, so we're doing a stream restoration project, but along with it comes this infrastructure project that benefits a population now that is being pushed out. It's benefiting the population that's coming in. Because of course we know white flight in the 60s, where now gentrification is pretty much the opposite of that. They're coming back. And so now you have these nice greenways that connect them to downtown or to restaurants or to sporting events. And the population that suffered the harms, as Carlton said, has been pushed out. So that's pretty much what we're trying to address in our stream restoration and floodplain buyout programs, which are two of our very large CIP programs. And we are I'm liking that I'm in this space because a couple of people said things earlier in two of the sessions I was in. And one of them was Dr. Jacoby Wilson, when he was saying that EJ is race-based, and I'm sorry, place-based. Because that was one of the items that we were trying to make sure that we addressed, was that what exactly happened in the past in Charlotte. And we weren't getting that information as far as racial specificity and, what was gone. And so I love that I'm here and just hearing all these things in a way that we can better implement these programs. So hope that helps.
So that was an excellent segue to Kofi Boone. And then I'm going to come back to Dr. Tony Graham. Professor Boone, it's my understanding that you have a background in historical landscapes. And, history is so much a part of the discussion of place, at least in the South and in that, in America. So given your background in sort of historical landscapes, what efforts do you think should be made to preserve historically Black and brown spaces? And then part two is with the federal government's Justice 40 initiative. Do you think it will be beneficial in doing so, or will it have no effect?
It's two really hard questions. We can have two conferences on each of those questions, but I will try and give a succinct answer to each one. Regarding historical and cultural landscapes, an important thing is to get the next generation of Black people and Black communities excited about these places and being connected to them. Through stories, through connections with the elders, through institutions, through events like this. What I found is that mobility and the idea that the place may not matter to future generations, that they will go where there's economic opportunity or they will go where they're able to go, and not being rooted in place. It has long-term consequences, social cohesion, mental and physical health, and just, the idea of what we call place attachment, the idea that, there are places that really hold the stories, in the dirt, that hold our people and our communities together. So I'm an advocate for anything that starts to build that intergenerational line and help people understand that these places, even though they're uh, beleaguered by numerous environmental injustices, are still worth fighting for, keeping, holding, and passing on to the next generation. In rural areas, the biggest culprit is land loss. And so historically, it was very difficult and challenging and sometimes dangerous for people to write wills and make decisions about how they're going to pass land down to the next generation. There's racial violence dealing with courthouses all over the country, and so many people are reverting to what are known as heir rights. And so when someone dies, an equal share of property passes to each living heir. And that is, in addition to USDA policies that were well covered through the Pickford case, is the leading cause of Black land loss, particularly in the South. So it's going to sound really simple and not very sophisticated, but convincing ourselves to, if we own property, or if we own land, is if we don't have a will, at least put them in a trust, so that there is some decision making about how it passes down to other folks. So at least we have the land available. Where it comes into conflict to some of the issues that Stephanie articulated and that Carlton articulated, we really, not just our community, Black communities, all communities need to improve our ability to live with the land. Racialized topography, which is what they were alluding to, this idea that at the time when Black people and African Americans could purchase property around the United States, it was often in the land that was undesirable to white folks. So you're in floodplains, you're downstream or downwind from noxious uses, that sort of thing. We face this in real life dealing with Princeville, North Carolina, in the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew, that everything from a technical expert standpoint said, no, you all need to relocate to high ground. But people were adamant about, like, look, this is the first town founded by free African Americans in the United States. You wouldn't do that or suggest that to another community, that we walk away from that type of history. And it's true. And what it instigated, which I think is going to be the close to this particular point, is new, more sophisticated tools for reading the landscape to identify places that can endure flood. And as they're transforming landscapes in Charlotte and other places, to parks and other places that can deal with those functions, those uses, helping to understand how that's not a loss, that's a transformation that helps to the long-term resilience of communities. And so I think there's multiple layers to that particular issue. With regards to Just 40, we are running into this here, which is readiness, and community leaders that are already overburdened with dealing with the management, pretty much in crisis mode in a lot of smaller communities I'm talking about now, that the opportunity of a lot of this investment and funding is getting missed because we haven't met the capacity gaps and the capacity needs of Black communities around the South and around the country, which is to say, we could write $50 and $100 million checks to town managers across the South to figure out how to deploy these really important just transition moves, but they just don't have the capacity to manage that. And so I think what's being missed is a capacity gap. I think it's exciting that now there's resources at the federal level, there's the will, but at the local level, we need to continue to invest in our communities and help build their managerial capacity. So when these resources come to bear, they don't get overwhelmed, and they can deploy them in a way that responds to their local community's needs.
Those were very excellent points, and that is exactly why we wanted to bring together a panel of the different professions that are dealing with this issue, because everyone has a different perspective: architects, landscape architects, planners, engineers. So now we're going to ask Dr. Graham, Professor Graham, to also kind of address his experience in research from the civil engineering perspective. Stephanie is an environmental engineer, and how it relates to this discussion. Are you ready? Okay.
Okay, great. As everyone so far has indicated, from this broad and wonderful background experiences that have been brought to this table of panelists, I think we're in a position to really enlighten a lot of individuals and organizations on the importance of what I call an interdisciplinary approach to environmental justice in the built environment. It's not a singular approach. And as has been alluded to already, we all live on one earth. There's only one land mass, and that's Earth. So regardless, as has been said before, we're the stewards. We have to maintain, regardless of race, creed, color, gender, ethnicity, you name it. And so over the years, I've been delving into this, partly with my students when I used to teach GIS and had them doing individual student projects. The students actually delved into environmental justice and in providing geospatial analysis and looking at their respective neighborhoods. And so this quick report is one of those. And then I'll just kind of hit on a few things, our race disparities to infrastructure access. That leads to health disparities in our disenfranchised communities. And so just from a definition purpose, the degree of variation of our physical infrastructure, as it says here, it differences across the different geographical spaces that we are in. And, the American Society of Civil Engineers have already stated we're in a poor state of mind with our infrastructure. But when it comes to history, historically, we receive less attention as far as the role of infrastructure, construction, and maintaining those infrastructures have played in promoting inequality and social segregation. And that's very important because the infrastructure is inseparable from the environmental justice issue. And so there's racism of the physical built environment of our highways. And it's been recognized, and that led to the actual infrastructure bill. And as the Secretary of Transportation brought out, these things do matter, and the administration has taken note and provided the country and Black and brown people communities funding to try to look at these racial disparities in our infrastructure, which happens to have an impact on the health and disparities in our communities. And so, if you didn't know, back in the 50s, that's when the Interstate Highway Act was authorized. And since then, it's been several thousands of miles of interstate. But when it comes to those highways and where they will be built, we just talked about that. And the impact on these communities of color, it impacts them a tremendous amount of way, where they're uprooted, displaced, replaced in kind. And so this was brought up by, another administration, another transportation secretary. And he alluded to the fact that, and here's an example of one of many, is Overtown down there in Florida, how that community was actually decimated, because of the infrastructure and the way it was applied to Black and brown communities. And so it's a systemic issue. It's an issue where, quite frankly, as a voting bloc, we have to look at. And 2024 is around the corner. So to make changes, you got to go to the voting booth to make these changes, to make them impactful and to make them effective. And so, of course, the interstate highway system didn't really cause all these problems, but once you put a road in an area, all of us know development soon follows, right? And with that development, it's economic development. And then here we go, social issues crop in, right? So our communities are reflective about that. So I went and found a study here about, the relics of racism and classism. And in this study, it's a geospatial study about access to healthcare infrastructure. And I hadn't thought about it in that way, right? So infrastructure can be impactful on the health of our Black and brown communities and other communities of at risk if they don't have a road network that allows them to go to a close in proximity wise healthcare facility. This particular study looked at the impact of the infrastructure system and COVID and how populations of Black and brown were being affected because they didn't have a direct access to a health facility in their communities. And so when we look at infrastructure and we look at disparities, there are multiple ways of looking at that. A lot of populations are greater than 5 miles to the closest facility. That's an infrastructure issue, right? The road condition, that's an infrastructure issue. More affluent populations, they have less than that. It's like the grocery store, it's like the food desert syndrome. You can go in one neighborhood, there's 5 grocery stores on one corner, you go another in a population, and you can't find a grocery store within 20 miles. Or so we are inundated with a lot of these things. And so I'm a jump back and forth on some things here as I go through here. So throughout doing my little research, and thanks to a great group of geoscientists down there in Tennessee State and up in Maryland and Morgan State, I was introduced to environmental justice tools. And one that's developed currently by the EPA is a tool set that looks at environmental justice across the nation. It has different variables. And here's where I'm really gonna take a hard stab. You know, the EJ screening tool, it's a nationally based, it's based nationally on national consistent data, and its approach is to combine environmental and demographic indicators in a geospatial environment so people can open up the map, look at it, and click on it and see where they're being affected in their communities. Most of this is not user-friendly for the general public and grassroots organizations, and a lot of them haven't heard of this tool. And so even if they've heard of it, they don't know how to use it, right? And so this EJ tool is being used now from a policy perspective to start to look at funding of the EJ funding to get down to the states from the federals, and then from the states down to our grassroots organizations. And herein lies the problem, right? How is that tracked? And we've already had discussions on the EJ tracking mechanism, and when it comes to race or the lack thereof of having this EJ tool identifying race in terms of its tracking capacity. And that's been addressed by the HBCU Environmental Justice Technical Team as we speak. And so therefore, there's a missed opportunity of the EJ screen tool by the EPA. And as it omits detailed references to race in this infrastructural data, which unfortunately, without nationally consistent infrastructure data on race, this tool can misrepresent the national consistent data because it is missing a major contribution to health disparities. And that's the built environment indicators. And I've looked at the tool a couple of times. I can't find but a few. And here's an example. It's a case study. It's a project I did with my research studies about 2 years ago now. And the environmental justice tool, from what I could find, only had one variable, and it was a proximity to traffic to variable within it. So this community is called Columbia Heights in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I actually grew up near this community. And it's surrounded, I'm use my arrow here, it's surrounded by infrastructure. US 52 here on the east side, you have another, on the west side, you have a parkway. On the south, you have industrial complexes on the north. You have another hodgepodge of industries. You have a racetrack, that NASCAR racetrack that races 7 months almost out of the year. And you have right in here a community, African-American community. It's been there for a long time. And right in here, you have a landfill. It's an organic landfill that's covered by an asphalt surface. And it's been there in that community for over 50 years. And it has a methane gas emission tower also right there. So you can imagine the environmental issues in that community, surrounded by that community. And the city has been trying to address that for years. Here's what is shown on the EJ screening tool. This is just how it's done. You just click on the traffic and it shows this. That's it. Nothing else is in there. So you really know what to make out of this. So if you want to try to do something with this, environmental justice funding wise, or what are you going to do with this? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of smart people out there smarter than me can figure that out. But I just wanted to show you that tool is a scrub in terms of actually assisting at the grassroots level to identify issues, because it hasn't collected environmental justice data for the built environment, embedded that into the environmental justice screening tool. And so as city planners on this panel, and as landscape architects on this panel, and as architects, practicing architects, and academia and environmental engineers, and you can see how our backgrounds in our communities are really important, and how this can be addressed from just developing a tool that our communities can use. So now it goes to architecture, urban planners, and infrastructure and environmental principles. I just took a stab at this, but in architecture and urban planning. So again, back in my background, my BS is in architecture engineering from A&T, my master's in my master's in architecture, and my doctorate in engineering is from Morgan State. And so as architecture and urban planning professionals, perhaps we need to take a deeper dive in looking at pursuing a conversation like this one on a more frequent basis, to have conversations on how architects and planners and of these professionals, I'm talking about professionals that really care about their communities, can then engage their communities and look at how architecture design is shaping the ecological context within our communities, and how, if it's not done carefully, it can actually start doing more harm and exposing us to more climate issues, environmental issues, and the like, to the spaces that we are actually being impacted on. Because once a building is built there, it's there for a long time, and it's going to impact that community whether we agree to it or not, right? And so we all know when that road is there for over 100 years, unless somebody tears it up. That building is there, it's going to have an impact for that length of time. And when these developers come in and put these big developments in our neighborhoods or close proximity to our neighborhoods, the same thing. And if they're not done carefully, and we start having our health issues in our communities. And that goes to building codes, in my humble opinion. I know the building codes already address these issues, but I think it needs to be a more stricter dive into these building codes, and uniform building codes, or other building codes for that matter, to put a lot of responsibility on these developers in greening our communities as they tear up our communities with their development, and replacing one tree for one tree. I mean, that should be a building code requirement, not replace one tree. I mean, tear down 35 trees and replace them with 2 trees. You know, it just doesn't make any sense. All right. And so we should look at requiring greening of our parking lot surfaces in all these developed areas to bring down that heat that's going to health impact in our communities. We can see that already. This, and looking at these abandoned buildings and these strip malls, and they stay there in our communities for years. Tear them down. Change the building code so they're tore down after a period of time, and then they're replaced with green spaces until new structures are built on those same lots. All right, and so these are common sense to me. These are common sense building code requirements. If you don't put it in the building codes, then you can't enforce it. Right, and so we all know urban planning puts these in the urban planning books, but there's a little bit more beef can be put in if it's put in the actual building codes. And so I'm gonna switch again now. We're looking at, in my opinion, another environmental disaster from an infrastructure perspective, and that's processing these lithium batteries and making these electrical vehicle batteries throughout this country. So I put 5 bullets here of where they're mined, what's the impact on the environment, where they're mined in the U.S., and where they're located. And so I just want to give everybody an idea now that we're headed possibly for another serious crisis in this country and in the world. So where are these lithium batteries mined? For the most part, they're in areas where forced child labor is at, right? And they're open pit as well, right? That's an economic disaster waiting to happen. It's an environmental disaster where it happens. Open pits is just a bad idea all around, right? And so processing and extracting this lithium, it consumes a lot of energy, a lot of water, and it pollutes the air on a large basis. And it has a lot of chemicals and heavy metals. It disrupts the habitat from wildlife, soil erosion, and some kind of way we have to start looking at this from a different perspective, right? So there's only one operation in lithium mining in the United States, that's in Nevada, and it is huge, right? And it's already having an impact within that community already. It's dependent, so where is the lithium mine for batteries? Australia, Argentina, Chile, China, right? These countries have poor child labor regulation. This is impacting our environment on a long-term basis if we're not careful, and it's going to have an impact on our society in the long run. Here are some examples if people haven't seen it, but this is my neck of the woods. This is actually, and I've processed this slide. This is a site that's under construction 15 minutes from my house in Liberty, North Carolina. It's 2 million square feet, built by Toyota for electric batteries. Look at the size of this thing. Look at the real estate it is consuming. And there's no green replacement plan that I've seen, I've found, that's going to replace all of this 2,000 acres of greening that they're going to destroy for the construction of this plant. There's another plant not too far from where I live at, and it's a EV plant by a Vietnamese company, VinFast, and it's over 2,000 square feet, acres, I'm sorry, 2,000 acres under construction now. But look at what we're really up against when we're mining throughout the world. These are open pit lithium battery mining sites. This is just a sample of what we're looking at in terms of our infrastructure and what it's doing to the environment with the lithium battery and the environmental justice, the electrical vehicle movement that's sweeping the world. And so, in summary, the rush to electrify vehicles may result in an even larger environmental crisis than we can imagine in the near future. So my question is 3 or 4, why not just increase the fuel efficiency of the current combustion engine market from 25, 30 to 100 miles per gallon? We can send a spacecraft to outer rims of the universe, but we can't or don't want to increase the mile per gallon on a vehicle. So the solution is to create another environmental hazard. Well, we only have one Earth. So thank you, panelists and everybody, for allowing me to vent a little bit on this built environment justice, bandwagon. But I'm kind of the guy, I like to call it how it is a little bit, So if nothing else, go vote in 2024. Thank you all.
That is a very valid point, and that we're going to end on sort of a futurist question, because we know what the challenges are. You've all outlined them. We know there are problems. There are problems now, and there are more problems coming. Climate change, we already knew disproportionately impacted certain people, and we know who those people are. So you can answer one of these questions, and we're going to go back through the panel. This will be the last question as we end. Is there a project that you find to be a good example of what it means to incorporate EJ in the built environment Or you can answer this question: what should this conversation lead to at the end of the day? So I'm going to go back around and I'll start with Kofi. You can either say, what project do you know that's a good example of incorporating EJ in the built environment, or what should this conversation today lead to by the end of the day?
I think it's a question. I'll pick the second part, which is leading to, especially after summer 2020 and the murder of George Floyd. I talked to a lot of communities that were more and more interested in communal and cooperative strategies, that they understood that individually it was very difficult to pull resources, to pull networks, to pull the things that are required to steward communities together individually, but at larger scales too, and decided they wanted to try to do it, in sort of in a mutual aid kind of way, and it tapped into a really rich history of particularly Black communities doing that. So right after the Reconstruction in the early part of the 20th century, W.B. Du Bois wrote it. Fannie Lou Hamer campaigned for it, with this idea that there's a lot of land decisions are in the grips of capitalism and exploitation. But when you start to find structures like community land trusts, like cooperatives and other ways, pull out the profit motive and deal more with serious stewardship of what it takes to make healthy people, that at smaller scales, it's more successful. So what I'd like to put out there is that there might be other ways that we could organize as communities and as people that sort of acknowledge the huge gaps that we have in terms of resources as we measure it from a capitalist perspective. But we're very rich in our networks and in our relationships and our histories and our connections to the land. So what I like to put out there in the future is that there's more of that there's more groups that organize, that center their value system around healthy land, healthy people, and that can start to fill the capacity gaps that I alluded to earlier.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ely?
Thanks, Pam. I'm going to take question number one, which is focusing on projects that are good examples of incorporating environmental justice. And I'm happy to say that there are plenty of great examples that are out there. One of the major challenges is the fact that often some of the best stories or some of the best examples are often left in the shadows. And so one of the responsibilities for those of us who are experts in the built environment while also being advocates, we also need to do a better job of telling the stories of how we have been guiding the changes that occur within our communities and not just reacting to them. My career as an urban planner is not a traditional path. A lot of my experience was focusing on public policy at the federal level, and there are planners at the federal level, but obviously many planners work at the local level. They work on design, they may work on zoning, they may work on other issues of that nature. But for me, my career was really about analyzing policy and analyzing what the long-term impacts of certain policies may be, especially looking at it from the context of race. I say all that just to emphasize that there are some very clear examples, and I had to spend a fair amount of time investing in correcting the deficits in my own personal education as a practitioner, especially after I left graduate school. The first place I lived after graduate school was Kansas City, Missouri, which is where I had my introduction to the 18th and Vine Jazz District, which Emanuel Cleaver played a very important role in the preservation of this historically Black neighborhood, because he wanted to make sure that the city balanced the goals of economic development and cultural development. And that project is now a $70 million success story. It is at the intersection of environmental justice and the built environment, because there were brownfield properties that have been repurposed within the Jazz District. Also, some of the cultural attributes associated with that project are equally important towards the goals of environmental justice. If you look at the 17 principles of environmental justice, there is a principle that focuses on culture. The first NEJAC report that was published, which was on the topic of environmental justice, urban revitalization, and brownfields, also spoke to the issue of preservation within people of color communities. So this is also a topic that is relevant to environmental justice, although we may not always think about it in the central narrative of what it means to advance environmental justice. Other great examples include the Regenesis Project in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is a $300 million success story. The last point I just want to make about that project is the fact that as an urban planner and as a storyteller, I use my own discretionary power to nominate the Regenesis Project for a National Planning Excellence Award in 2014. And I did it because I wanted to make sure that members of the American Planning Association, which has 40,000 members, were able to see very clear, tangible examples of what does it mean to encourage equity in the context of planning? What does it mean to encourage environmental justice in the context of planning? Because we can talk about these issues, but if we don't connect people to real clear examples, tangible results, places that they can visit in order to really see what can be the real outcome in terms of this type of work, then they just tend to just look at it and perceive it as being theory. And instead, what I wanted to do as a practitioner was to make sure that people understand that these type of results do actually occur. You have to think critically about how you approach these issues. And you also have to modify your way of working on these issues in order to lead with racial equity, to center racial equity, to think more critically about how do you address unintended impacts rather than treating those issues as an afterthought. So they are very clear examples across the board.
Absolutely. And thank you for your work in also developing, I guess, the Equitable Development Awards during your time at EPA. Carlton, you've done a lot, and we really appreciate it. I'm now going to move to Stephanie Roberts Bowman to address either of those questions. And I totally see a conference coming out of this discussion today, because we barely got through 3 or 4 questions, and you all have such a wealth of knowledge that we need to share more in an interdisciplinary way. So Stephanie, whichever question you'd like to address.
Absolutely. So I'm going to take question 2, and I'm going to take that because I absolutely agree with Pam that we certainly need more future discussions about this interdisciplinary, because the missing part that I see in the entire reparation space, and that includes the reparative environmental justice space, is the reparative part. And again, Dr. Wilson spoke about that earlier with Dr. Ali, is that we're missing the reparative part, and that's the difficulty that I believe that we have currently, and that other, again, municipalities, cities, and counties will have, because America very much seems to understand reparations until it comes to Black Americans. And so in these spaces, in your city or county, a lot of times you're the only one pushing the reparative part. Everybody seems to be very clear on possibly not on how not to cause future harms. But if you have 400 years or, however long of kind of accrued disadvantage, of disadvantage on top of disadvantage on top of disadvantage, then that absolutely needs to be repaired. And convincing people, Alon said this in a previous discussion that we had about, if I have to convince you that racism is an issue, then I'm just wasting your time. But unfortunately, when we're the only ones in these spaces, that is often the first step. It's just convincing people in your space that racism, in this particular case, environmental justice or environmental racism, is an issue. And I just feel like the future of the built environment and other infrastructure projects is being able to push that politically. Everything to me comes back to politics, because if we can't get our local leaders and then on our state leaders and on to the federal to kind of institute or enforce the reparative part, then it's pretty much just a wash. I mean, so I think that's what I want to come out of this is, me in my county and someone else in their county. And, if we can figure out how to do this and assess how these programs are implemented, not only how they will be implemented, but how they were implemented in the past and how we can fix that. And that is what I really want to get out of this is it's just the reparative part, that unless we repair, because as I spoke a little bit earlier about the 2 programs that we implement, I wasn't just throwing it out there. It wasn't just a kind of a, well, this might happen. No, this is happening. And so as I think Carlton was just speaking about a historical Black neighborhood. This is a historical Black neighborhood where I have a project. I started at the county 9 years ago. When I started 9 years ago and I started designing the project that is almost complete now, that neighborhood was absolutely 97% Black, American Black, 97%. And now in 9 years, it's maybe 50. And that is an issue. I mean, I can't, and I discussed this again internally, as we're working on on this environmental justice plan, and I'm saying this is actively happening. That's a problem. That's not just market forces. That's a market failure. And I feel like if we get the reparative part right, that then we can kind of move on. But we got to get that part right first. And I'll go ahead and land there because, as Sophie said, we can have 2 conferences. So I'll land right there. But that is that is what I want us to do next.
Thank you. I'm going to segue over to Professor Dotson, our resident Afro pessimist. His own term, or the term he introduced me to, and I'm going to let you address either question. You're on mute again.
I struggle with my pessimism and trying to think about optimism. I failed to mention during the introductions that over the last 10 years, I was working on my doctorate at Purdue in American Studies and bringing my architectural and urban studies background to that field. And that's what kind of led me down the path towards Afro-pessimism. But part of what I was doing was visiting places and spaces where people were working in the trenches to try to make a difference, make a way out of no way in the midst of anti-Black space that we all find ourselves trying to survive in. And one of many places that I visited, one of the many fourth world cities that I visited was St. Louis, in the St. Louis metropolitan area. And I ran across Sylvester Brown, who some of you may have run across. He was one of the leading characters in the documentary, The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, because he grew up in Pruitt-Igoe. And Sylvester Brown is an activist. He is a local journalist in St. Louis, and he started what's called the Sweet Potato Project, where he's working with youth in the North St. Louis area primarily, in planting sweet potatoes on vacant lots all over the city. And that grew, modeled in part after what was done in Milwaukee with Growing Power, in actually selling that food and processing it even to the local school system to provide a more balanced, healthy, locally grown meal in the school system, and cookies and other byproducts of sweet potatoes. Sadly, that project didn't really survive COVID. COVID was a very difficult and elongated time period from it. And a lot of these organizations are fragile in terms of resources. I don't know if Sweet Potato Project will recover or resurface. But even with that, what happens is oftentimes these organizations plant seeds for other organizations to start. So when one thing goes away, something else happens. And in this case, the Sunflower Project came out of that. And there's a group that's planting sunflowers on vacant lots all over St. Louis. And then right across the river in East St. Louis, in a even more disturbing environment, is Elizabeth Patton Whiteside. She's a public health administrator at the East Side Health District, where people come and get WIC support for their children and food stamps and other things. And she decided right on the side of the public health administration building to start an urban farm, a pretty major urban farm and encourage people who are coming there, offering free training on how to grow your own food. Now, I know that we're talking about growing our own food all over the country, from Malika Keeney in Detroit to Imhotep Adiza in Indianapolis, all over the place. But to do it at a health district for a city of East St. Louis, one of the most physically, socially, institutionally abandoned spaces in the United States, is something to marvel. And so we have to celebrate these people that are working in the trenches and trying to make a difference, and again, making a way out of no way. So those are just two examples of many, many people that I see that are making a contribution and pushing back against the injustices that we are so familiar with in this lopsided nation that we live in. Thank you.
Thank you for those examples. I always want to end with some direction for the future. Clearly, the challenges of environmental justice, the built environment, and health disparities are immense. But we do have people like yourselves working on these issues. I think the problem has been that we've been very siloed. I am an engineer in the public health space. There's nobody else here like me. We do have a theoretical physicist on our SIEGE team, and other folks with a climatologist, meteorologist. So we have other technical people, but these discussions, and you all so beautifully illustrated the interconnectivity, the intersectionality. These discussions have to be held more broadly. And I'll share that one of our colleagues at Tennessee State, who's super active in NSBE, where I was the environmental justice director back in '96, has shared that we're going to submit a conference description for the NSBE conference in Atlanta in March. So everybody mark your calendars. I'll be getting back in touch with you. March 20th through 24th, NSBE pulled out of Florida. We will be in Atlanta. And NOMA and APA, Planning in the Black Community Division, all to follow. And Association of Landscape Architects, I believe one of my ASCE colleagues is now working for your group. She was our pre-K, our pre-college initiative director. So there's plenty of opportunity to continue this discussion. As you've all shown, there are plenty of examples of things that have worked, and we just have to continue to focus and to speak across all of our areas. And I'm certain that we will be moving towards a successful future. On Saturday, I'm going to incorporate climate equity into the discussion. So be sure to look out for some of our climate equity action planning as we continue to delve into what climate change looks like in these environments as well. And who knew we would have had Maui but when we first started talking about this discussion. So thank you again. I appreciate all of you. And this will close out the environmental justice and the built environment panel for today. Can they hear me? I don't think so. Nope. We're good?